Hi, I'm Ash, but you can call me Icon for short. I wanted to take a moment to talk about disability. It's a subject that I think doesn't get discussed enough in the mainstream, and I figure instead of asking people to have a big think, I could lay some groundwork for future conversation. My goal here is to explain some fundamentals about disability that you should know if you want to talk about it, and some things to avoid when talking about disability. Hopefully this makes sense and can be a useful primer for people who don't know all that much right now, but are open to learning. Just as a quick warning, this video contains a lot more terms than I usually like to use. I feel like they can make these kinds of videos less accessible to people, and they also allow people to argue over semantics rather than focusing on the point. However, in this instance, these terms, or some like them, are things you'll likely bump into if you decide to do your own research on disability, so I figure it's good to give you an idea of what they mean here, so you don't get lost when reading articles or speaking to disabled folks. Part 1. Some terms. One of the things I found out the hard way when looking for an adequate definition of disability to cite is that there aren't many good definitions of disability. I decided then, since this is my video, that I'd write my own and see how that works. This definition is rooted in theoretical and real-life experience with disability. By the way, I'm not just making something up out of thin air. I felt comfortable doing this because even though I'm including a definition, it isn't really intended to be a major takeaway of this video. I'll go more in depth into a more helpful understanding of disability later on, but the definition helps to get us all largely on the same page. Disability is a consistent or recurring cognitive or physical difference that makes performing activities of daily living through traditional means more difficult. This definition is deliberately broad as to include mental health issues, neurodivergence, or even long-term but temporary physical injury. The reason to include all of these under a definition of disability is that anyone who experiences any of these is subject to some form of ableism. This can be internalized ableism, in the case of injury, for example, where a temporarily disabled person may feel useless for not being able to do things how they normally would. This can also manifest as prejudiced behavior toward disabled people, such as testing someone to see if they are really disabled, which is an experience common among those with both physical and mental health disabilities. Neurodivergent people who do not view their neurodivergence as a disability are still targeted by ableism and face internal and external pressures influenced by ableism. So I wanted to make sure that my definition didn't wrongly imply that neurodivergent people can't experience ableism. I want to briefly mention the language to use surrounding disability. Academic literature on disability seems to still be undecided as to whether or not disabled person or person with disabilities is preferable, and I'm using them kind of interchangeably in this video. General terminology varies between countries. For example, in the UK, identity-first language is more common, but in the US, you'll more commonly see person-first language. Just as a quick illustration of this, while government websites in the UK will refer to disabled people or disabled individuals, comparable resources from the US government will typically refer to persons with disabilities, or some equivalent. From my interactions with disabled folks, they generally tend to prefer identity-first language, but there are always plenty of exceptions to this kind of generalization, and I would definitely advise looking into the specific terminology certain communities prefer. Definitely try to avoid anything like disableds, or out-of-date terms like handicapped or crippled, which are more commonly understood today as slurs. I'll have an article linked in the description that you can read for a little more insight into this specific aspect of the conversation about disability. It's an interesting read. First, I reference activities of daily living, or ADLs, a term I'm kind of borrowing from psychology. My explanation of it here is going to be a bit incomplete and oversimplified, but this video is already long enough, so we're going with the short version here. Activities of daily living are the basic things one needs to accomplish to survive, and they're a major part of how people classify mental health disorders. Examples of ADLs would be working, shopping, eating, and activities that permit you to do those things, like getting to work, going to the store, or cooking. I say that these are more difficult to accomplish through traditional means because they are not usually impossible, and in some admittedly rare cases, are actually less difficult. That might sound weird, but a simple example to illustrate this is stairs. People who have motor disabilities often have a very difficult time with stairs, which can make it really difficult for them to get around in urban areas, where buildings often have multiple floors, and sometimes even have stairs leading to the entrance of the building. This introduces extra issues for their ability to get around to do important things, like get to work or go to the store. This sounds like things are more difficult for them, right? Well, yes, obviously, going up or down stairs is very difficult for some people with motor disabilities. You know what's much easier? Elevators. Elevators are actually easier than using stairs for everyone, and at present, they're a staple of urban construction. The Americans with Disabilities Act was an important factor in the now seeming ubiquity of elevators and ramps in the United States, but I don't think anyone would say that having to use elevators is harder than using stairs. That's why I say ADLs are more difficult through traditional means, and not just more difficult, period. There are two small bits of wording that I'll expound on a bit here because they're relevant to much larger ideas. The first is consistent or recurring. By this I mean that the difference is long-term, and either persists for an extended period, or occurs with enough regularity to hamper one's ability to do ADLs consistently. A lot of disabilities aren't necessarily ever present. Lots of physical disabilities can wax and wane, so to speak, and mental health disabilities like bipolar disorder can be experienced in infrequent bursts of depression. An example to help illustrate this would be migraines. If you have a single migraine in your entire life, while it is undoubtedly disabling while you experience it, it doesn't impede your ability to do ADLs in a meaningful way. It's possible to miss a single day at work, or not go to the store once, and be mostly fine, depending on your circumstances, of course. If you had intractable migraines, occurring over an extended period, then that could be considered a disability, because it could impede your ability to work, socialize, or even eat. I mentioned before that my definition wasn't really supposed to be a major takeaway, and that's because disability isn't really a singular experience or narrow range of experiences. I gave a definition at the start to help us get on the same page, not just by establishing what sort of stuff we're talking about here, but also how varied disability can be. Many people can mistakenly envision disability as something all-consuming and debilitating, so I wanted to quickly illustrate some of the different ways disability can be experienced, and this definition was a pretty good opportunity to do that. Part 2. Models of disability. Because disability is kind of a broad category, approaching disability requires some model of the concept that can be applied to the majority of individual cases. If you noticed, my definition earlier didn't say that disability was an impairment or deficit, but a difference. Why would I bother making that distinction? To understand that, we'll have a brief history lesson. In the early times of humanity, or whatever, a model of disability formed in the West, particularly Christian Europe. Disability here was understood as a sign of moral failure, an indication that one was deficient or of low moral character. Disabilities were usually understood as deserved punishments from God, either for individual failings or the failings of one's family. This model is known as the ethical model of disability, and it positions disability as punitive and shameful, a condition that is brought about by a sinful nature. Disabled people were often shunned from society, not usually outright killed off, but sometimes merely left to die on the side of the road. Most often, though, disabled people would be kept apart from normal society. This model encouraged people to take pity on people with disabilities, and charity toward people with disabilities was considered a way of demonstrating one's kind and forgiving spirit. I want to quickly acknowledge that all of this will be very reductive, bare-bones history, since many of the specifics aren't necessarily relevant, and there are always exceptions to these general frameworks. The ethical model is largely a Western thing, to my knowledge, as plenty of Asian and African cultures had a very different view of disability, and while the ethical model is broadly accurate to Western Europe, there were still exceptions within Europe to these general trends. Pre-industrial societies, for the most part, kept disabled people as part of their communities, so the ethical model is far from reflective of human nature or anything. The model also existed in some form before Christianity, where in ancient Greece, for example, some characteristics of the ethical model were present centuries before Christianity's inception. These models are not comprehensive, consciously constructed perspectives, but rather a set of general societal trends with a heavy slant toward Western Europe. Just keep that in mind going forward. Toward the time of the Enlightenment, when medical science in Europe was starting to take off, the popular conception of disability began to shift. Medical science is rooted in a very normative set of assumptions about human health, that humans are essentially perfect, and health could be understood in terms of deviations from that perfection. Disability, in this context, was viewed as an aberration, a problem that had to be corrected, a disease. The framing of disability as disease might seem somewhat innocuous, but it brings with it the need to contain and eradicate. Individuals with diseases are safely locked away from the healthy public, and research is put into eradicating the pathogen. Many worried that, if allowed to exist freely in society, disability would act as a corrupting influence on the populace, spreading like a virus. This led to centuries of institutionalization, where genuinely horrific acts were committed by researchers and doctors in the name of finding a cure for disability. Later, eugenicists would take these ideas even further and consider disability to be a basic genetic flaw that should be eliminated in order to advance the evolution of the human species. This paradigm of disability as individualized biological deficiency is known as the medical model of disability, and it has been the dominant paradigm for hundreds of years. In recent decades, though, as institutionalization began to decline and civil rights became a more common topic of discussion, disabled people and their allies found an opportunity to introduce a new model to the social consciousness. In the social minority model, which is technically two models, but they're so related that I see no reason to discuss them separately, disability is viewed in terms similar to race and gender, a difference that is largely socially constructed. The main problems that disabled people face, according to this model, are external in nature. Issues with accessibility, representation, and stigma are the main sources of frustration for disabled people, and much of the self-esteem issues they deal with are less a result of innate or biological deficiency, and more to do with internalizing societal standards of what is normal and desirable. The social minority model views disability as a category defined not by individual capacities or difficulties, but systemic and societal barriers, and sees the best way to help disabled people as fighting for greater acceptance and accessibility. Part 3. Ableism. Like race and gender, disability is viewed under the social minority model as being largely defined by how society views and treats people. Similar to disability, race and gender have both seen histories of pathologization, and both have tried to justify these categories using medical or ethical arguments. Race science classified people as belonging to different racial groups based on cranial measurements and muscle density, and sexist and transphobic assumptions about gender identity tried to find physiological or psychological justifications for pathologizing women and trans people. Sexualities that deviated from the perceived norm also faced pathologization, most famously with gayness having been classified as a mental disorder until relatively recently. What truly unites people under these categories, then, at least on the societal level, is a shared experience of oppression and marginalization. These all manifest differently, of course, for each of these social classes, but these unifying experiences are important to recognize as part of the categories themselves. Disabled people all experience at least some form of ableism. It's not possible for a disabled person to live in a society whose beauty standards and cultural norms exclude disability and never face ableism in any form. Some people might not care about it, some might be ignorant of it, and some of them might even accept that those ideas are true. But regardless of what an individual disabled person thinks about ableism, there are unifying themes that make those ideas harmful. If you are disabled watching this, I'd encourage you to reflect on these ideas and think about whether or not they've affected how you view yourself. For everyone else, I'd ask that you keep these ideas in mind when discussing disability or interacting with disabled people.
They say Lewis succeeds by portraying them as objects of pity, reinforcing stereotypes of the disabled as helpless and childlike. Jerry's orphans in detail for the first time.
They've got a problem. I hope that they get better.
Well, how can you say that? I mean,
How can I say it? Listen again. They have a problem. I hope they get better.
But these people have this disease, and they say you're making them feel childlike.
I feel terrible about that. It's a shame. But while I'm playing to 100 million people that think what I'm doing's okay, I can't worry about or dignify 20, 30 people. I can't. I haven't got the time for that.
Some disabilities can make some aspects of life more difficult for disabled people, especially if they don't have access to necessary care or equipment to help them live independently. This often leads empathetic people to, somewhat naturally, feel bad for disabled people who have a harder time with some things than others might. I don't want to imply that this response, feeling bad for someone, is an inherently negative thing. However, it can easily lead to, and often stems from, a harmful perspective on disability. Disabled people may have difficulty doing certain things in certain ways, but empathizing with their frustration is not the same as pity. Pity has a much more sinister undertone, and carries assumptions about someone's quality of life. Disabled people are fully capable of living fulfilling and happy lives, and capable of operating independently in a lot of cases. Viewing them with pity implies that their existence as a disabled person is inherently lesser, which is not merely untrue, but actively damaging. This mentality is often what introduces people to eugenics, where people who are assumed to live lesser lives are treated as disposable. Expecting parents may consider terminating a pregnancy if their child is likely to be born with a disability, because they assume that the life they live would be inherently lesser, and death would be preferable to such a pitiful existence. Even after birth, many parents would rather their child potentially die than potentially live with a disability. Parents who are skeptical toward vaccinations tend to be fueled by a belief that vaccines have a causal relationship to the development of autism. The anti-vaccine movement is predicated on the idea that living as an autistic person is such a wretched existence that dying of preventable disease would be preferable to living a long, healthy life as an autistic person. Taking inspiration from disabled people is not, inherently, a negative thing. Being inspired by the work a person does, their accomplishments, their drive or ambition, that's common to popular figures regardless of ability. However, when it comes to disabled people, the list of achievements people will cite often contains overcoming their disability as something they find inspirational, something that takes courage to do. This perspective is really just a clever disguise for the same pity that I just discussed. Disabled people, when pitied, are viewed as people who face such a fundamental challenge to surviving that accomplishing almost anything is considered impressive. People may compliment a disabled coworker on being an inspiration for how dedicated and accomplished they are, despite their disability. Children with disabilities are often cited as sources of inspiration when people assume that to continue to live as a child with any disability must be disheartening or depressing. Again, I want to make it clear that disability does not necessitate suffering. Disabled people are fully capable of living enriching and fulfilling lives. The success of a disabled person should never be viewed as occurring despite their disability, because disability isn't synonymous with unproductive. Much of the reason many disabled people are unable to succeed is because of accessibility issues and discrimination, systemic barriers, rather than their individual disability. An interesting linguistic distinction can be seen that falls along these lines. Many disabled people who are lauded as sources of inspiration will often be said to have succeeded despite their disability, but it's rare to hear someone describe a black person as succeeding despite their race, a gay person succeeding despite their sexuality. The success of people in these groups is contextualized within the oppression they face. Women succeed despite sexist barriers, gay people succeed despite homophobia, racial minorities succeed despite racism. Disability, though, has the issues one faces in succeeding pinned on the disability, subtly reframing the problem as disability intruding in spaces where it is not intended to be. In this framing, the problem is not that the workplace is inaccessible, it's that the disability prevents one from using the space as intended. The problem is the disability. Disabled people refer to the tendency people have to treat them as sources of inspiration, largely because of their disability, as inspiration porn. Inspiration porn, it should be noted, is not confined to popular figures or celebrities with disabilities. Oftentimes, this same attitude will be used to objectify ordinary disabled people, portraying their mere continued existence as an inherently courageous act. This inspiration porn serves several useful functions in the context of ableism. It helps people ignore discussions of ableism and societal barriers that disabled people face by highlighting their accomplishments as positive successes and ignoring the failures of the systems around them. It positions disabled people's role in society as fundamentally unproductive, in contrast to normal people, who are expected to be as productive as possible at all times. It reinforces the idea that disability is pitiable in order to make the privilege that non-disabled people have seem justified or natural. Inspiration porn takes the premise of highlighting the achievements and success of marginalized people and reframes it in the context of ableist assumptions. A lot of people who lean liberal can fall into the tendency to play along with inspiration porn, since on the surface, it celebrates something that they care about, productivity, and also the success of marginalized people. A more thorough analysis, though, recognizes that inspiration porn inherently demeans disabled people, and frames their issues as being individual problems, rather than a result of systemic and societal oppression. Inspiration porn treats disabled people like props over recognizing their humanity, and instead of fostering acceptance, simply masks ableism in a thin veil of patronizing politeness. A common assumption made about disabled people is that they are, in some form or another, incompetent. Now, there are plenty of disabled people who have challenges in certain areas, but the issue here is not recognizing limitations. The issue is the generalization of disability to frame one, like I mentioned earlier, as being fundamentally incapable of doing anything themselves. There are many ways this can manifest. Disabled people may be viewed as perpetual children, in need of constant care and supervision without input from the disabled person, infantilizing them. Sometimes people will just ignore the disabled person entirely, and ask the people with them about them, rather than addressing them directly. Incompetence is a major theme in how people experience ableism, and is the most common in my experience. The assumption of incompetence has its share of harmful side effects. Disabled people are often not made active participants in their own lives. Doctors give them orders, caregivers or family members do everything for them, and strangers treat them as though they aren't even there. This can erode any sense of independence that a disabled person has, and the path of least resistance is usually just to go along with it and become a passive observer of your own life. Disabled people and their advocates should work to ensure that independence is encouraged at every step. Doctors are there to help, so ask for advice on how to achieve your own goals, and treat them as resources for information and care instead of as wardens who control your life. Family members should be encouraged to allow as much space and independence as possible, and have it pointed out that constantly doing everything for their disabled family member or members may make them feel useless and disrespected rather than cared for. Discussion of an individual disabled person's limitations, needs, and goals should be encouraged. Independence needs to be fostered in order for disabled people to build a healthy self-esteem and self-image. Otherwise, they tend to buy into the idea that they can't do anything themselves, and along with that, they can lose hope that they'll be able to make decisions about their own lives. Incompetence is one of the ableist ideas that tends to be internalized the most, and it can lead to a very harmful self-image. It isn't the only factor here, of course, but often, disabled people will build an identity in contrast to their disability. Rather than accepting themselves and their disability, many disabled people view themselves with denial, pretending that they aren't disabled. Obviously, they recognize they have a disability, but they will often view themselves in their minds as not being disabled. One of the authors of my main source for this video, Richard Salsgiver, has cerebral palsy, and had this issue of denial. When Salsgiver was younger, he was a brilliant and active student who had to use crutches to get around. He recounts that he would often react with shock or surprise when he saw himself in the mirror, seeing the disability he preferred to ignore and pretend wasn't there. In his early professional career, he would often overexert himself. He bought a house too big for him, with a driveway that was literally physically painful for him to walk down. One night, he slipped on a patch of ice and severely injured his hip. He had trouble getting into his car, and it was near impossible for him to get up his driveway into his house. Despite that, in an effort to prove to himself and others that he was just as good as everyone else, in an effort to show he wasn't a disabled person, he walked on his hip the next day, in severe pain and with great difficulty. He cites this as an example of his mentality at the time, where he had to prove he wasn't disabled, that he wasn't slower, less capable, less of a person than his peers. He did that by living as though his disability wasn't there. People who develop an identity separate from their disability can face this self-destructive problem. Ignoring your disability can cause you to hurt yourself through overexertion, which can cause serious and lasting physical or psychological damage. Knowing your boundaries and limitations is healthy, but disabled people often feel a need to prove themselves to others or to themselves, to demonstrate that they're just as good as everyone else. Integrating disability into one's identity and sense of self is important to ensure that they succeed through means that work for them, and don't cause themselves harm by trying to reject their disability. The last one I'll talk about here is the various divine, or sometimes cosmic or karmic, explanations of disability. These are commonly seen in the modern day in response to acquired disabilities, disabilities that come about later in life, but can be applied to congenital disabilities, disabilities one has at or acquires soon after birth. Blindness is a common example of this. In the Bible, Paul the Apostle is blinded by God as a test of his faith, and finding his faith in God restored his sight. Many people see disability in these terms, as a challenge to overcome, an obstacle placed in your path that you're meant to get over. Many wise people in ancient mythologies, as well as modern fantasy, are blind, so sometimes disability can be seen as a sort of transaction, where in exchange for some ability, one gains insight or wisdom. And as mentioned earlier, disability can be seen as a punishment of some sort, a consequence of one's moral failings. Paul is actually a great example of how these conceptions can play off of one another. Blindness, for him, was a punishment from God for his lack of faith, but it was also a challenge to overcome, and allowed him to gain new insight. All of these views reinforce harmful conceptions of disability. The idea that disability as a test of character or faith can prevent one from fully recognizing and integrating their disability into their identity. The idea of disability as allowing one to gain new insight, while positive on the surface, actually has the potential to make disabled people into props or symbols of some kind, rather than recognizing their humanity. All of these also imply that disability inherently lessens someone's quality of life. By thinking of disability as a test of character, you implicitly frame disability as a condition that one must endure, a state that should be avoided or overcome. This frames disabled people who face more difficulty than other disabled people as being lazy, of poor character, or simply unwilling to put in the effort to overcome their disability. Disability as a gift also implies that in order to bear having a disability, one must have gained something in return, that nobody could possibly accept living with a disability unless they had been given something to compensate them for it. And obviously, viewing disability as a punishment implies that it's bad. All of these ableist ideas about disability are things to watch out for, but by no means is this a comprehensive list. Some general guidelines are to think about the ethical and medical models, and compare them to the ideas you come across. Does this assume that disability is individual? Does it portray it as a moral failing? Does it imply disability is equivalent to suffering or pain? Use those models to try and figure out if a statement or idea has an ableist influence. Part 4. Disability Identity. A lot of people seem to like to compare disability and race, based on my reading so far, so I'm going to do that for a second here, if you'll indulge me. Racial identity for minorities, especially in the case of Black Americans, can exist in a couple of ways. You can view the racism you experience as being deserved, and accept the negative implications of the racial identity being forced on you. You can reject or deny your racial identity, and do your best to ignore systemic and societal prejudices that impact your life. Or you can embrace your racial identity, and transform it into something positive, a culture to belong to rather than a label that's applied to you. Disability identity is a bit like that. You can buy into ableism, try to ignore the ways society stigmatizes your disability, or you can try to make disability into a culture you can identify with, rather than a category you're assigned to. Something that might seem a bit odd to people is that disability rights wasn't a bigger issue in the 60s. After all, women's rights, LGBTQ+ rights, civil rights, all those movements work together to fight for equality and against oppression, so it seems like they'd be natural allies. And they were. Plenty of disabled people participated in those movements, and there was activism around disability rights. I'll have a link below where you can read up on the subject if you'd like. So how come that's not one of the big issues we think of when we think of the 60s? Part of any countercultural movement is not just the force against the status quo, but also the push for something new. Disability rights activists had plenty of issues and recommendations, but one problem that the movement faced, and still faces to some extent, is that a strong subculture is an important way to unite people on issues and rally support. Disabled people, though, have a lot of trouble forming culture through traditional means. Millennia of collective propaganda and social conditioning has robbed disabled people of their agency and independence, and it's difficult to form a subculture when you aren't even allowed to leave your room. This is less of a problem today, thanks to the internet, but the unfortunate reality is that disability culture is uniquely difficult to build. Historically, culture is built through proximity, shared experience, and common goals. Disabled people have the last two, but proximity has been an issue in the long term. Institutions didn't really allow for the creation of a disability culture, and ever since institutionalization went on the decline, disabled people have been locked away in homes or hospitals. Building a culture is very difficult when disabled people have been intentionally cordoned off from not just society, but each other. Thankfully, this is beginning to change. Online communities offer spaces that disabled people can use to congregate, discuss issues, and invent unique cultural symbols that help foster a sense of community. Personally, I had met maybe 2 disabled people in my life before I started spending more time online. Now I know a bunch of autistic folks and disabled folks, and it's been really helpful and empowering to see other people who share a lot of my experiences. Disability culture is one of the most important components of the final thing I want to discuss here, which is positive disability identity. Positive disability identity is the opposite of ignoring your disability or viewing it as a problem. On the contrary, it's an embracing of disability and all that comes with it, and the beginning of a fight for disability rights. It is a radical acceptance of one's existence as a disabled person, and entails a recognition that society must change for disability to be accepted. Neurodivergence supplies a rough model for this. Autistic people have, in recent years, been able to reclaim autism as an identity, building a culture around it that allows an autistic individual to feel less like a defective normal person and more like a member of a subcultural group. This has helped a lot of autistic people, including myself, realize that the issues they face in society aren't their fault, and that things have to change if they want to be able to live as autistic people. Other forms of neurodivergence are still underrepresented and misunderstood, but autistic people have been able to force the subject into public discussion, hopefully constructing a foundation for further understanding and acceptance in the future. A key realization in the process of developing positive disability identity is the recognition that the ableism one experiences is unjust. This might seem like kind of an obvious statement that bigotry against disabled people is bad, but ableism is so incredibly pervasive that challenging it can feel kind of ridiculous. I once thought that it was ridiculous to ask that everything else change to suit me. Everyone else seems to do fine with how things are, so asking for change is just me being selfish and lazy. This is part of why disability culture is so important, because going against the mainstream on your own feels, or at least looks, like selfishness or laziness, like you're asking for special treatment. These ideas are so pervasive that they tend to be somewhat self-reinforcing. Language like the R slur, words like handicapped and deformed, these are incredibly common, and they are invariably used to evoke a negative impression of disability. As a personal example, I have told almost no one outside of the internet that I am autistic. This isn't really because I'm ashamed of being autistic, but more because I didn't want people to assume that I was stupid, mentally deficient, or weird just because I'm autistic. It took me a long time to recognize the ways this implicitly frames autistic people as being deviant, how not embracing my autistic identity in public was itself reinforcing those harmful stereotypes. Even my drive not to be misunderstood was rooted in the belief that I am better than other autistic people, that my ability to mask and look normal should entail better treatment. I used to struggle a lot with how I was supposed to reconcile who I thought I was with the idea of being autistic, and what standard I should hold myself to. Should I expect myself to be like neurotypical people? Hold myself to that standard of behavior and insight? Or should I lower the bar, give myself credit for being able to navigate social situations as well as I do? That changed when I met another autistic person. I hadn't met any other autistic people before, and it was honestly a little awkward at first. We talked occasionally, and I'd like to think we're friends. I remember one particular conversation where they were telling me about social norms, how they just didn't get some of them, and how they felt when they didn't navigate a social situation properly. They beat themselves up, confused and frustrated, wondering what they did wrong. Now, I did exactly the same thing, and in fact that's a habit I'm still trying to shake, but this interaction was a revelation for me. I told my friend that they didn't do anything wrong, and that it's okay to screw up occasionally, because neurotypical social conventions are weird and complicated. That probably sounds pretty innocuous to you. Like, yeah, duh, that's the normal, supportive thing you'd say to a friend. But after I said that, I couldn't help but think, why don't I ever tell myself that? That was the beginning of an admittedly ongoing journey of self-acceptance. A lot of marginalized people have trouble feeling adequate self-compassion because when all of society is against you, it's really hard to genuinely believe that they're all wrong. But empathy is a great shortcut. I care about my friend, and I know that their screw-up isn't their fault, so I'll tell them that without a second thought. I care about myself, but I have a harder time convincing myself that something wasn't my fault. Empathy and community are incredibly important foundational elements of the journey to self-acceptance and positive disability identity. It might be hard for you to think that the problems you face, ones that you've probably blamed yourself for your entire life, are actually societal issues. A community can help expose you to similar experiences, and empathy for their experiences can help you to have a little more self-compassion. Part 5. Conclusion. Wow, we've covered a lot. Let's do a little recap so you can see if you missed or need clarification on anything. If you have any questions, please ask away in the comments or on Twitter or Curious Cat. Disability is a concept that has been understood through a lot of models. The ethical model sees disability as a pitiable state that denotes moral failing. The medical model views disability as a deviation from the norm, an individual imperfection that must be cured or corrected. The social minority model says that disability is more of a social construct, defined by shared oppression rather than dysfunction. This model is used as the basis of disability rights activism that seeks acceptance of disabled people as full members of society. Fighting for these rights, disabled people have been building a culture that allows them to see others who share their experiences and recognize the injustice they face. Ableist ideas can impede this activism, such as the belief that disability is equivalent to incompetence, that disabled people are objects of pity, or that disability acts as punishment for immorality. These ableist ideas can impact the self-image and self-esteem of people with disabilities, and make them feel inadequate, incompetent, or hopeless, and lead them to ignore their disability to prove themselves. Disabled people should be encouraged to seek independence, self-advocacy, and acceptance of their disability to build a healthy self-image. I hope this has been a helpful primer on some of the basics of disability. If you're thinking that this seemed pretty comprehensive and thorough, I hate to break it to you, but this was all based on a single book, as well as my personal experiences and the experiences of some of my friends. There is so much more literature to explore, and so many awesome disabled folks to talk to and learn from. I didn't even have time to touch on the history of disability law, or how militaries paved the way for advances in disability rights, or how disabled people conceptualize things like freedom and autonomy. I'll answer as many questions as I can, but I'm unfortunately not an expert in this stuff, and I only experience one particular manifestation of one particular disability under a particular set of circumstances, so I can't possibly speak for everyone. I can't tell you what it's like to use a wheelchair, or how it feels for people to stare at you because of your disability, because I don't experience those things. Please don't harass disabled folks asking them questions either. If you're interested in learning more, I'll have a link to my source for this video in the description. I'd recommend checking that out first. Alternatively, I'll have links to a bunch of disabled folks who talk about disability often, so you can browse through their stuff to learn more and hear about the experiences of disabled people from some primary sources. I have a Twitter and a Curious Cat, if you don't want to gamble by leaving a YouTube comment. I'd be happy to answer any questions I can over there. I'd also like to quickly thank my friend Addie, who is one of the people who helped me make this video. She gave me detailed notes on my script, which led to making a lot of changes, and including some extra information that I had previously left out. I included some minor things she disagreed with that I felt strongly about, so don't mistake this for her fully endorsing everything in this video. She just helped me make less of a buffoon of myself. I had a few genuinely embarrassing slip-ups in this video before she looked it over, so thanks again, Addie, for helping me look like slightly less of a fool. She's got a Twitter, YouTube, and Twitch. I'll have those in the description too. I'd recommend checking out her stuff. Her perspective is much more grounded and in tune with disability culture than my more book-smart approach, so hopefully you can learn something new. I also want to thank Skittles of Kay and Skittles, who graciously loaned me her assistant Kay for a bit to consult on this script. They have a great video on disability that I will link to that expounds on the social model part of the social minority model, and also has some compelling interviews with disabled folks talking about their experiences with disability. Highly recommend it. I'll also have links to their Twitch and YouTube channels. Thanks for watching, everybody. I hope you have a good rest of your day.